In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to dynamically add methods to a class at runtime using Groovy. Welcome back, friends. Dan here, and if you're new to the channel, you can head over to danvega.dev and learn a little bit more about me. One thing that you'll find is that I do have some courses available. Some are free, some are paid. This question actually comes from my Groovy course. So I have the complete Apache Groovy developer course, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 hours of content. Teaches you everything you need to know about the Groovy programming language. And we go in depth on a lot of different things with some really great examples, I think. So if you're interested, go ahead and check that out. But with that said, let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. All right, so we're just going to jump right into IntelliJ here and create a new project. Feel free to use whatever IDE you want to use. I'm just using IntelliJ Ultimate here. I think I'm actually using the beta for 2020, but again, this should work in any IDE that you usually write Groovy in. So I'm creating a new Groovy project. I'm going to use Java 11 with Groovy 2.5.7. At the time of this recording, 3 is out, but I'm just decided to use 2.5 right now. Haven't had a lot of time to play around with 3, so probably everything that we're going to do here will work in 3 as well. So let's go ahead and hit next inside of Groovy. We're going to call this dynamic methods. And nothing special going on here. Right inside of source, we're just going to go ahead and create a new Groovy script. And I'm going to call this person demo. All right, so in this Groovy script, I'm just going to create a new class and we'll call this person. And inside of person, we'll have a first, we'll have a last, and we'll have an email. And down here, I'll just say person is equal to new person. And at that point, let's go ahead and just print out person. So print line person. If we go ahead and save this and run this, that is why I wanted to do this real quick. So if you're using Java 11 and Groovy in IntelliJ here, you may come up with this error, and I found that you can fix this by going into File and Project Structure. So I'm using 11, and if I go into Modules under Dependencies, I want to go ahead and add one. And this is actually in the, so if you go into the folder, so I have 2.5.7 here. If you go into lib, there's these extra jaxb. I'm just going to use that whole folder and add that as a compile dependency. I'm going to go ahead and hit apply and hit OK, and let's go ahead and try and run that again. All right, so we got the printout of the person. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. So one of the things that you can do in Groovy is you can go ahead and add properties and methods to a class at runtime using metaprogramming. So let's go ahead and look at some documentation. All right, so I will link to this documentation in the description below, but here's the runtime and compile time metaprogramming doc. So this is a really good place to start if you're not familiar with how this works, especially if you're coming from something like Java. But what I want to look at here is the default metaclass, so metaclass implementation. So by default, objects get an instance of metaclass implementation that implements the default method lookup. This method lookup includes looking up the methods of the object, but also if the method is not found, it will resort to calling the method missing, which we're going to look at in a little bit. So we have this class here. There's some information about the custom class, but what I want to look at is something called the expando metaclass. And Groovy comes with this special metaclass that is called the expando metaclass. So there's something called an expando in Groovy, which allows you to add properties and methods to it by expanding. It's a way for us to dynamically change like methods, constructors, properties, or even static methods using a neat closure syntax. So you can see the syntax down here. We access the meta class, and what I want to do is just dive back into the example and talk about how this works. So when we create a new person here, we have our compiled class over here. If we look at person.class, you'll see that it implements something called the Groovy object. So if we go ahead and look at Groovy object has a metaclass. So you can access it using get metaclass or just metaclass because you can access properties in Groovy that way. But that metaclass then is allowing us, it's actually an expando metaclass underneath the hood, and that allows us to go ahead and add properties or methods to it. So what we can do is before we create an instance of that, we can say, hey, person, I want you to use the metaclass, and I want you to create a new method called say hello. And you can either use the left shift operator or the equals sign here, and we're just assigning a lambda. And that lambda is going to go ahead and say hello. And we'll throw a little emoji in here. And so now, when I have this person class, I can go ahead and say person.sayHello. And this is going to work even though there is no method on this person class called say hello. And there we go. So this worked fine because we defined the say hello method before we created a new instance of the person. But something interesting will happen if we go ahead and try to do that after the fact. So let's say that the person instance has already been created, and then we're trying to attach a new method called say hello. Let's go ahead and save that, and we'll run it. And again, I'm running this using a keyboard shortcut, Shift-Control-R on my Mac. But what it says is missing method exception. No signature of method person.sayHello is applicable for argument types and values of this. So basically it doesn't exist. So why is that? So if we go ahead and run this again, we will see that this works again. And then what I want to do is jump back to the documentation and just look at something. So one of the things that it says down in here is that by default, expando metaclass doesn't do inheritance. To enable this, you must call expando metaclass.enable globally before your app starts, such as in the main method or a servlet bootstrap. And this is important because this is, again, if we want to do this after the fact, we would have to turn that on. So this is the expando metaclass.enable globally. So let's go ahead and move this back down. And let's turn that on. So let's say expando metaclass.enable globally. So this is just a static method. So static enable globally. Call this to enable global use of the expando metaclass within the registry. This has an advantage that inheritance will function correctly, and metaclass modifications will also apply to existing objects. So that's important. It's an existing object that we're attaching this to. It is also important to note that this has a higher memory usage on the JVM than normal Groovy. Again, you're doing some crazy dynamic stuff at runtime, so that is going to take up more memory. So just be aware of that. But now this is enabled, and we go ahead and run this. That will work. So that is the basis for our example today, and we're going to dive into another example, and this really came from a question from the course like I was telling you before, and we'll talk about how to dynamically add methods using method missing, and let's go ahead and jump into that demo. Alright, so here we are in source. I'm going to create a new Groovy script. I'm going to call this developer demo, and we're going to create a new class called developer. And developer is going to have a list of languages that he or she knows. And we're going to have one method in here. We'll call it coffee. And this is going to just print line turning coffee into code, which is the only thing I'm good at. And then what we're going to do is let's go ahead and save that. And so let's create a new developer. We'll say developer Dan is equal to new developer. And we're going to say dan.coffee. And let's assign, actually we'll come back to Dan. Actually, what I want to do is go ahead and add some languages. Let's say Dan.languages. Let's just go ahead and add a few. So let's say I wanted Groovy and Java and JavaScript. And then what if I wanted a method called writeJava? Or actually writeGroovy. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So as we expect, we create a new instance of our developer. We call the method called coffee. So it prints out a line saying turning coffee into code. And then we get a missing method exception. Because we've not given a, because we have not written a method in our developer class called writeGroovy. So Groovy gives us a way to kind of catch these methods. And this is using the method missing function. So let's go ahead and say method missing, and this takes two arguments, the name of the function that was called and the arguments that were passed to it. So the first thing I want to do is just print line and say method was called for, and then we'll say name so we can see what method was called. Alright, did that not run? I don't know why that is not running for me, but let's try that again. Okay, so turning coffee into code, method was called for writeGroovy. So we've caught a way to catch any method that wasn't created in this class. But we probably don't want to have a catch-all for this, right? Like we don't want every single method. What we want to do is any language that the developer has defined on there, we want to be able to call a write that language. So writeGroovy, writeJava, writeJavaScript, those would all work. writePHP would not work because we haven't defined that language on the language list here. So let's start doing that. What we want to do is just say Boolean. And if you've followed me for a while, I've done Groovy for a long time now, and I used to use def everywhere. And if it's driving you crazy that I'm giving all of my variables types, it's just a matter of using Java a lot more, and I think I just kind of use the type when I know what the type is. So that's kind of just what I default to. If that's driving you crazy, I'm sorry. So I'm going to say languages.find, and this find method will take a closure, and we can say, let's go ahead and split on the name. So the name is getting passed into this method missing. So we're going to say write is the first part of it, but I actually want the second part of it, right? I want whatever that language is. So then if writeGroovy was the name of the method, it'll be Groovy, and it will look to see if Groovy is one of those languages. So if it is, if language, oops, we don't want that. We want language exists. If the language exists, we're going to do something with it. First, we want to get the language, and we can do that just by doing that split again. So name.split, call write, and we'll get the index number 1 there. So that'll give us the language. And then we'll say if languages.contains that language, so then we can go ahead and create a method for this. So we're going to use that same tactic that we used before for adding a new method to the class, but now we're doing it at runtime, and we're doing it dynamically because we don't know the name of this method. Well, we're kind of figuring that out now, right? So what is this method going to do? We're going to call this method write code. And again, we're just creating this just like we did with the person.sayHello. We're creating a new method here. So this is going to be a lambda. And again, if it did take any arguments, you could do something like object array here, because that's what this type is. But I don't need any arguments for this. I'm just going to go ahead and say print line. I enjoy writing code in language. Let's just say language. All right. So that'll give us what the method body should actually do. So now, since we're inside of this developer class, we have access to the metaclass, right? Because this extends the Groovy object, which has the get metaclass in it. So we can say metaclass dot, and now we can do this dynamic way of creating this name. So we can say metaclass dot name. So the name of this is going to be write Groovy that first time. So we can say metaclass, I want you to create a new method called write Groovy, and it's going to be equal to the write code method, the lambda that we just wrote up here. Finally, we're going to just return write code and call that. So we want to actually call it. We've attached it to our metaclass, and now we want to call it. So one thing you may hear this referred to often as is the Intercept cache invoke pattern, and this was actually dubbed by Graham Rusche, the one of the authors of the Grails framework. And the reason is you're intercepting this method. You're looking to find out if you want to attach it to the class, and if you do, you attach it to the class, which is then caching it, and then finally you're invoking it. So intercept, cache, invoke is kind of the pattern that we're using here. And that's what I refer to it as in my course. So everything here should go ahead and work. So let's go ahead and save it. Now I said should work, but it's not going to. And you probably already know why. So missing property exception, no such property write Groovy for class exists. And if you remember, we have already created this new instance, and we're trying to attach this method after the instance has been created. Finally, we just need to do that expando metaclass.enable globally. And let's go ahead and do that. And you can see now it calls and it goes, I enjoy writing Groovy. So now we can say dan.write Java, dan.write Java script. And if we go ahead and run that, those all work. And if we go ahead and write something that we don't have any language in, oops. Let's go ahead and run that. And that should throw a missing method exception. I don't know what that is. Method was called for write PHP. That should not have worked. If languages, oh, sorry. So yeah, print line method was called for write PHP, but we never get into here and actually say I enjoy writing code in PHP, which is exactly how I want it to work. Okay, so that is a little bit about how you can not only add methods to a class, but how you can do it dynamically at runtime using the method missing. So I think that is where I'm going to stop today's tutorial. So question of the day, what are some of your favorite features in Groovy? I'll go ahead and put that question below. Please go ahead and leave me some comments on that. And if you found value in this, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. And as always, friends, happy coding.